At the time of recording this, it is the day after Christmas, and this thing will likely be uploaded before New Year's. So while you're all still hopped up on that holiday spirit, I am here to bring you crashing back down to the cold reality that is that your favorite characters, whoever they may be, will likely never find happiness. On the chopping block today is Isolde. We're going to be talking about who she is, what makes her tick, and most pressingly, why she's turned out the way that she has. Now, for starters, it's pretty clear that the Isolde in our suitcase is maybe not completely lucid, right? She has several lines that would indicate that her state of mind has been altered, or that the reality she is experiencing may not be completely congruent with the one that everyone else is experiencing. And I think a clue to as to why this may be can be found near the end of Kakania's character story. At this point, Isolde has been left in a catatonic state following the events of Vienna and the Ninth Storm, and while initially Kakania believes that this is a result of her hypnosis gone wrong, she eventually finds this notion to be false, right? The hypnosis has already run its course. Whatever is wrong with Isolde is something internal, right? Something intrinsic to herself. And we're going to be examining that today, primarily in relation to the philosophy of Carl Jung, because a lot of what Jung wrote is very, very applicable here. So, for some basic background, Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who is widely considered to be the father of analytical psychology. He was so influential in the field that Sigmund Freud had initially considered him to be the successor to his own work. And while Jung wrote extensively on various aspects of the human mind, for our purposes today, we're going to be looking specifically at how he defined and classified the human psyche. In very, very simple terms, Jung split the mind into three parts: the conscious, the unconscious, and the collective unconscious, though in this case we primarily care about the first two. Jung likened the mind to a spotlight on the stage. Wherever the light shines is where the light of consciousness lies. Whatever is captured within it are things that we recognize and are consciously aware of. And in contrast, everything within the darkness is the unconscious, right? Things that we can't actively acknowledge or may not even know exist. And when that spotlight moves, when it shines on other aspects of our mind, certain sections are brought to the forefront while others fade into the background. Our conscious and our unconscious are constantly kind of shifting in between all of these different states. And it's the interplay of this kind of internal light and darkness that both molds a person's personality and also kind of gives rise to all of the things that ail them, right? All of these neuroses that cause us, difficulty in our daily lives. But how does all of this tie into Isolde specifically? Well, a lot of this interplay revolves around how the self interacts with the world at large, right? Certain factors in our environment may act as stressors to our development, prompting us to either promote or hide aspects of ourselves for the sake of, fitting in. And for Isolde, these stressors were particularly significant, right? Just from the circumstances of her birth, we are given enough clues to come to the conclusion that Isolde's life has been quite constrained. Right? Not only is she scrutinized as an arcanist and as a woman in a society where both attributes are considered to be the precursors to mental instability, but she is also beholden to her bonds and her duties as a scion of a noble family, right? From a very, very young age, Isolde is constantly told that a daughter of the Dietersdorfs must present herself in a very particular way, right? All her life she is told how to properly act, how to speak, how to walk and eat. Pretty much every aspect of her existence was governed by regulations and stipulations. And in order to abide by all of these rules, Isolde was forced to shunt down the aspects of her personality that didn't necessarily conform to this, right? And in their place, she adopts the role of the diligent child, the prim and proper young lady, and later on the mindful and demure noblewoman. And this is kind of where we get our first piece of our puzzle, right? That of Jung's theory of the persona. The word persona is derived from the Latin mask or character, and similarly, the persona that Jung describes is a metaphorical mask that we don in order to be deemed acceptable within society. Right? They are aspects of our conscious mind, a constructed face that is basically tailor-made for any given situation. The you that you would display to your friends, the you that you would display at work, and the you that you are when you're alone are all very likely different from each other, and none of them can really be considered your true self, right? They are personas molded to fit a certain role. They do not fully represent who you truly are. At best, they are slivers of how you envision or desire yourself to be, and at worst, they're a complete fabrication, an act, right? And if there's anything that Isolde is good at, it is acting. Right, the creation of the persona is basically synonymous with what Isolde does in order to cope with her environment. However, in her case, it is taken to a much, much more extreme degree, with her Arcanum being a very tangible representation of this. Isolde's ability allows her to call upon ghosts and have them possess her, resulting in these huge shifts in her composure and her personality. And in doing this, she is able to, adapt and thrive in a variety of social situations, which is very similar to what the function of a persona is, albeit in a much, much more literal sense. However, we can also see that this takes a significant toll on her mental health, right? The ghosts torment her, they wear away at her mind and her sanity, and expose her to these horrifying visions, and some go as far as to cause her acute physical distress in the moments when she has her guards lowered. By relying on this arcanum of hers so excessively, Isolde's psyche begins to strain, her sense of self becomes corroded, it becomes more and more fractured among all of these competing identities, or in this case, all of these competing ghosts. Because we craft these personas in order to exist harmoniously within the world, it's natural that they become something closely tied to our sense of self, right? Our sense of identity. However, because of this, a sort of dissonance begins to arise between our true self and the persona. It's this lingering sense that we are not as we present ourselves. We are not who we claim to be, that we are in fact frauds. And in order to avoid this, in order to shield the mind from this, in order to align our views of ourselves with what we represent, we begin to subconsciously identify more and more with our persona, seeing it as our true self when, it's not. However, in order for this to be possible, we have to discard various aspects and things about ourselves that don't necessarily align with this persona or even with society in general. And therein lies our second clue. These things that we deny and repress, right? These aspects and views of ourselves that we consider wrong or disharmonious don't just vanish when we cut them off. They are still a part of us, regardless of how vehemently we reject them, and they stay with us. All that happens is that they're shoved down into the unconscious, where we can't see them. And in doing this, what Jung called the shadow arises, a reservoir of all of our rejected and discarded parts. Well, if Isolde calls forth ghosts to assist her, and these ghosts can be considered metaphors for the various personas that she wields, for the various aspects of her psyche, then the one that is closest to her, right? The one that most intimately knows her, the one that doesn't seek to please external forces, is going to be the one that represents her shadow, right? And in this case, it's the ghost that looks exactly like her. It's Trista. And yes, it's very possible that Blue Pox simply just, reused the young Isolde asset for Trista, but I really don't think that's the case. We've seen Blue Pock give characters who are significantly less significant than Trista unique sprites and assets, right? So for the character who is essentially the narrator for Isolde's character story to be a simple reuse seems unlikely to me. And Trista embodies all of these aspects that, while normal in most people, would have been heavily discouraged or outright denied in Isolde's own development. Right? Malice, possessiveness, hatred, resentment, even emotions like affection and love, all of them Trista expresses freely. And I think making them look like was a very, very conscious decision, right? Specifically because Trista was meant to represent this facet of Isolde, the facet that she has denied, the shadow. But we have all of this information, right? All of these elements of Isolde and her development that seem to line up with Jung's model. How does any of this actually apply to Isolde's current state? Or how she even got to that current state to begin with? Well, what Jung considered to be the root of human neuroses, right? The cause of dissatisfaction with life or the feeling of incompleteness is the natural and inevitable friction that arises between one's shadow and one's persona. He believed that the shadow is projected onto the environment as a sort of cognitive distortion, a warped perception of the world based on all of these repressed feelings. The things that we reject within ourselves, the things that we don't like, are the things that will manifest more clearly to us externally. Right? If you're quick to recognize certain negative traits in others, it's possible that these traits are recognizable because they are aspects of your own personality, but because they're something that you despise and you try to repress, you can't easily acknowledge them, or you may even be unaware of them. And we see this sort of distortion displayed specifically in Isolde's character story. While it's not written from her point of view exactly, the tone and the style of the writing itself shifts. Everything becomes portrayed as sections of a play with a narrator addressing us directly and the background characters speaking as if they're reciting lines from a script. It's a reflection of the warped lens through which Isolde views the world, right? Her perception that the whole gamut of life's pleasures and woes amounts to nothing more than a performance, that all of the people that surround her are mere actors. Her own self is repressed so much, and she is forced to don so many masks, that the world and everything within ceases to hold any real substance, right? Anything of actual truth. It's simply just another role to take and to perform to perfection. And there's a coldness to Isolde, right? A detachment that paints her as a passive observer to her own life and actions, and in a sense, she is. Herself is merely watching the performance of these various personas. She herself doesn't actually have any real agency. It isn't that she doesn't recognize the contradictions of her persona, it isn't that she doesn't want to acknowledge her shadow, it's that she can't. She isn't even aware of that distinction to begin with. And I mean, that's pretty clearly displayed in her various therapy sessions that she has with Kokania, where the truth behind her brother's death lies veiled behind these layers and layers of obfuscation. It's only as Isolde's mental state deteriorates, as her shadow becomes more and more empowered, that the truth of Theophil's demise becomes more apparent. Jung recognized the danger in ignoring the shadow, right? That in refusing or being unable to acknowledge it, the shadow has free rein to burgeon and grow without restraint or guidance. If our distortions, these warped views of reality, these things that we hate about ourselves are left unchecked, they may begin to manifest unconsciously in our thoughts and our actions, right? For example, a person who believes that to be assertive is to be selfish may then spend their entire life driven about by the whims of others, never actually asserting their own needs. And as a result, they eventually develop a feeling of resentment towards others, and knowing that this feeling is wrong, they then also develop feelings of guilt. Right? These guilts and this resentment lies within the shadow, and given enough time and neglect, begin to seep into the personality, leading to someone who is bitter or angry with the world and other people. And Isolde manifests this very same phenomenon, though in this case I don't think it's resentment that lies at the heart of her shadow, but pity, right? Because her view of the world has been warped, the distortion well and truly established. Isolde kind of reaches this sort of negative epiphany, right? Her understanding has shifted radically to become that to live is to suffer, and conversely, to deny life is to show mercy. That's why she kills Theophil, right? That's why she kills her pets. That's why when Greta dies, her only response is she was an incredible woman. There is no remorse, because to Isolde there is nothing to be remorseful or sad for. Her experiences, the emotions dwelling in her shadow, have painted the world as a place of burdens and constraint, with death as the only respite from it. It's a shame that these people had to die, but it's for the best. They have found salvation. You know, every shift that we see her go through, her descent into delusion, her departure from rationality, the slow surfacing of all of her repressed impulses, the murders, the associations with Manus, all of these are done in the service of a goal that to her distortion makes perfect sense. Every play must eventually end, and it'll be the better for it. Jung writes of integration, not purification. The shadow isn't something to be vanquished. Unlike Freud, Jung didn't even believe the shadow was something wholly evil or negative. It is just the repository for all of these aspects of ourselves that we have kind of shoved aside. Right? Basic desires, natural instincts, even strengths that we've instead interpreted as weaknesses, they all dwell within the shadow. They are as much a part of our being as our ego and our consciousness is. And because it's a part of that whole, rather than hide or ignore or spurn it, Jung's proposal for curing all of that which ails us is to instead seek out the shadow, right? Rather than repress and deny, which only serves to exacerbate the issue, one ought to consciously look within and make an effort to identify these things that we find hateful or shameful. And in doing so, ultimately assimilate it, right? Understand, address, and guide our shadow, and in some cases, incorporate aspects of it as part of our conscious ego. Integration, not purification, right? But with Isolde, the shadow hasn't been assimilated. Rather, she is the one who has merged into it. She has gone in the complete opposite direction of what Jung proposed. It is the natural endpoint in allowing the shadow free rein. Unable to recognize it, she has given it the freedom and the means to overtake her ego entirely, right? The only lens she has left is one warped by her own personal, distorted perceptions, and the big Isolde ghost in the final fight is the ultimate culmination and visual representation of this. Right now, her shadow governs her thoughts and her actions, divorcing her almost entirely from what reality truly is. Isolde was never able to integrate her shadow. She simply couldn't. She never had the mental framework or the perspective or the support to do so. Her entire life, she has been told that this aspect of herself was something that could never see the light of day, right? That it was something that she needed to bury deep, deep down forever and ever and never acknowledge. And I mean, she did exactly that. She played that role to perfection. So, when people try to help her, when Kakania tries to help her, there's nothing to help, because what they're trying to help isn't actually Isolde. It's just this mask that she has displayed to everyone else that she doesn't even recognize is, a mask. So when it comes to that final fight, when we confront Isolde within her own psyche, when all the things that she fears or is ashamed of are laid bare and given control, no one has the tools necessarily to properly address it. Not Isolde, not Marcus, not even Kakania. Yet somehow we must still defeat it. And I mean, yes, her shadow is eventually defeated, but we didn't integrate it. We killed it. Our shadow, as much as we may despise it, is an integral part of ourself. It is a requisite piece for us to find wholeness. Now Isolde is docile, not because she's complete, but because an aspect of the self has become irrevocably broken. We have excised a core part of her. It is, in a sense, a spiritual lobotomy. And what's left behind is a collection of persona without a purpose, right? Void of any sort of basis or core, with their role and their era and their reason for being no longer extant. They instead just fabricate it, right? They replicate the only world that Isolde knows how to function within. It's an eternal play, this happy dream from which she probably won't ever truly awaken from. But we are going to be awakening from this dream and finishing up with the video. These particular videos are a little bit on the frustrating side at times, just because there's so much to look into, and sometimes the interpretation that I've been working on turns out to fall flat on its face and then I have to start all over again, which that's kind of annoying when that happens. But the more I do these more research heavy topics, the more I kind of realize that I actually kind of find this stuff interesting. So that's nice, at least. I didn't need to go through a dozen analyses on Jung's philosophy or his archetypes or whatever for this thing. The first 2 or 3 were more than sufficient, but I just kind of kept going, which isn't really great in terms of efficiency or throughput, but it is what it is, I guess. But thank you to Ayn Rand, Paul Ryan, and Mikoyan for supporting me on Patreon. I cannot properly express just how much I appreciate that every time, But with that, we're going to go ahead and call it for this one. As always, thank you to everybody who is watching for the support and the likes and the comments. It does mean the world to me. And even if I can't always respond to comments, I do read all of them. So thank you, right? But that's the video. I will see you all on the next one, all right? Bye-bye.